This episode was made possible by our generous patrons.
Welcome to episode 150 of the Inktofilm podcast, where we read the book
And then see the movie.
I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
And this week we discuss Greg Rucka's 2017 comic and Gina Prince-Bythewoods' 2020 film of the same name, The Old Guard. So James, I don't know if you realize this, but we're missing out right now by recording this when we are.
Why? Why is that?
It's the second night of the RNC, and we are just missing it to record this. I mean...
Shut it down. I got stuff to do.
Are you going to be okay? I know that there's quite a lineup tonight that we're going to miss out on. They're wondrous words.
I think I'll live.
Yeah, I could have turned it on earlier and just got a little taste before he came in, but then when I showed up on camera, because we're on Skype, you would have seen the face melted guy from
Raiders?
Indiana Jones. That would have been me when I got on. So
I see.
Let's instead we won't do that. Instead, we're talking about The Old Guard, which I don't know about you, but like I had a ton of fun with this. So I'm really curious to know like what your thoughts were on this. We read the comic, we watched the movie, both.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun with it. Going in, I think that you had mentioned that like there was getting a lot of buzz, and I remember seeing people talking about it, the Netflix movie specifically, and I saw it on Netflix, obviously, just because they're how they are with their marketing, so it was everywhere. And I was like, oh, cool, Charlize Theron. Like I like this whole role that she's really like developed for herself as like this. Like action badass. Like these are cool movies to like, because I think it's kind of a boys club, and to get like the Charlize Theron as a badass like assassin is a cool kind of part of her career. Yeah,
I mean, I think that probably really kicked off with Mad Max Fury Road, unless, correct me if I'm wrong, there was maybe something before that.
I mean, she had like Aeon Flux was like 2005, so that was like her in sort of an action-y role. Yeah,
that was her, wasn't it? Yeah, you're right. And then she did Atomic Blonde, I want to say. I didn't watch that one, but I actually heard it was good. Like, for the action was good, at least.
Yeah, I like that, I think, more than most people. It was fun. It was sort of her John Wick. It was like, I think, very specifically made to be... And I don't know. It was cool. It was stylized. I liked sort of the look they were going for. It was like 80s Germany or something like... I think it was Germany, but it was like sort of like an 80s... Like, it had some neon in it, and like there was some cool... But specifically, I think that movie was made... to just showcase amazing choreography and fight scenes, and which I feel like this kind of could also be seen as in a way as well. It's sort of a superhero movie, sort of like fights going in. This was going to be, the fights were something that I think people were going to be talking about.
Yeah, I could see that for sure. So the way we're going to try and cover this is we're going to have a short, spoiler-free discussion for anybody who maybe is just curious about The Old Guard, want to know if we think they should check it out. Then we're going to move into talking about Greg Rucka. Then we will talk about the comic. Then we'll talk about the filmmaker. Then we'll talk about the film. So we have a lot to get through. So because of that, we're not going to do like an in-depth scene by scene. And instead, we're going to jump around. But we're going to save that for when we get to the spoiler sections. Just for now, general thoughts. I also do want to establish, we've talked about this before, I feel like I'm still a complete novice when it comes to comics. It's not something I grew up reading a lot of, and we've covered Watchmen now, we've covered Snowpiercer, and I guess Live, Die, Repeat was based off of a light novel, which I think we didn't cover the actual manga, but we covered the novelized version, but I remember looking at the manga. But anyway, so that's basically all that we've covered in this realm, and then now we get into The Old Guard. And that's basically what I've read. Like, I haven't read many comics beyond that, unless some are slipping my mind. So once again, I feel like I'm very new to this. So if I come in, I'm like, oh, so cool, I did all this stuff, and you're gonna be like, yeah, they do that all the time. That might happen. So you can let me know if anything is not actually new and exciting when I think it is.
Yeah, I was thinking about this recently, how the comics were such a huge part of my like sort of nerddom growing up. Like, I loved reading comics, I loved reading manga, I loved watching anime, I loved fantasy novels and all of these things. But strangely, I feel like with as like the tide was rising for comic book movies, I felt myself reading less and less comic books. And I was thinking about during this, I was like, man, it's just fun to sit down and I have jumped into some other series more recently. Like Paper Girls was one I was like starting to try. I didn't get all that far, but I've been slowly sort of like chiseling my way through that one. But I just love comics. I think it's so cool to have this visual medium while also being very much like narrative writer focused. Like it's, you know, the singular mind of maybe not singular in comics case because you have your illustrators and things like that, but a writer can really go to certain lengths that it would be much more expensive to do in like a movie or something like that. You know, they can do anything possible and not have to worry about the budget of, you know, be beholden to a budget and tell these like crazy over the top stories in some cases. And I just really love the medium, and anytime we're able to cover it, I think most of the reason why we haven't jumped fully headfirst into a lot of the comic book adaptations is it's you know, once we open that can of worms, there's a lot of of movies, I think it's
opened it now though.
Yeah. Well, it's also like well trodden. I feel like at this point, if we wanted to start talking about all the Marvel movies, like we would be, you know, it would take up a lot of our schedule, and maybe we will eventually.
Well,
but
I think honestly, I don't know that there's. That's where I think we probably won't go. We probably won't go to Marvel or DC, just because so saturated and. I like the idea of doing these like somewhat lesser known comics, right? Or I mean, I guess Watchmen isn't lesser known, but it's not, you know, it's not Marvel DC, which is like the kings of all comics, it seems like, right?
Kind of, yeah. I would say like I wouldn't say never. We're never going to go there because I think there are sort of like certain arcs within stories that I think we could cover. They're pretty concise and self-contained to where we could cover them, and they're not sort of just like your typical, like, you know, at the end there's a giant blue laser that's trying to kill everyone and that's the end of the world, like, you know, digging more into character and digging more into like sort of interesting concepts.
I wasn't trying to say that wasn't the case. It was more just that, like we were talking about with saturation, like I feel like there's a lot of Marvel podcasts out there if you really want to get into that, and people who know way more about comics than I do, so I'd be coming in like such a noob to it. Yeah,
I think at some point I could see us covering like a Batman, like one of the Dark Knight films or something like that. But I you know, for now, I don't think we're looking to go headfirst into like superheroes necessarily, but I do like this is a superhero story, you know, ultimately.
It kind of is. I feel like there is some subtle differences though between this story and like your typical superhero story, which I know like everybody's doing that these days, but these aren't like caped crusaders, you know, by any stretch. You know what I mean? Like they're just people, and I think that's one of the things I love most about this story. And we're still in spoiler-free section, so I won't get into it too much. But I think it's safe to say that if you've known anything about Old Guard, it is about some immortals, right? Like I think that's in all the materials you'll ever see for this, and in all the trailers or what have you. That conceit works really, really well here. I think it's one of those things that writers are always looking for, and that is a familiar concept with like a new twist that is interesting. So it's like familiar but fresh. And I was getting that for sure from this story, because it's like, oh yeah, we know about vampires, we know about all these other immortals we've read about over the years, but this felt different. And I was trying to figure out like what really separates this and what makes it unique. What's your thoughts on that? Without spoiling, I guess I'm sure we'll circle back to this as we get more in depth.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel that it was familiar. You know, I felt like, okay, they're taking things that they like from a lot of different stories and kind of trying to push them all together. Things that I like the most about this story are sort of the historic elements. I feel like, you know, I think the tantalizing little bits we get of like potential flashbacks we could be getting from really any era. I felt like, as somebody who really, you know, I feel like this also kind of awoke something in me that I haven't thought about a ton recently, but
it's awoken something in you.
Yeah. Well, it's like history was my favorite one of my favorite subjects, I would say. That and English were like my favorite subjects in school. And I realized like how much I haven't done any reading about, you know, pre-modern era history. You know what I mean? I haven't done a lot of world history since high school, I guess, you know, maybe a little bit in college. And just thinking about certain eras and how, you know, things could be playing out for characters, because they are immortals. So like, who knows what they've done in their lives. I just think like that sort of background material is the stuff that I was like, oh man, I'm really interested in this stuff. I think that's what's ripe for continuing the stories beyond this.
Right. So let's approach this. I want to approach it from like spoiler-free comics and then spoiler-free movie real quick. So as if someone was coming up to us who had not ever read, seen, or knows next to nothing about the Old Guard, and they're curious about reading the Old Guard comic. How would you describe this comic to them, and what would you say to them to get them to read it, or would you say don't bother? Like how would you? I assume we both seem to like it, so I think we would say to do it.
So I think most people would agree. This is an awful, horrible movie. Not this movie, The Old Guard, but this is. I'm going to give an example. There's something in Wolverine Origins or X-Men Origins Wolverine, that movie that came out in like 2007-ish.
Okay.
That movie, the best part of that movie is seeing Logan through every war. Like seeing these flashbacks in the beginning of the film where it's like, oh my God, it's Wolverine and he's in the Civil War. And like those moments, I think, always are interesting. I think seeing like somebody who's like, otherworldly in a battle that's based in our history, that of any kind of history, we're seeing, people think like what could possibly have happened if there were superheroes on the battlefield to sway battles, and what lives would have been saved and how would things have been different. And like this kind of is able to give you some of that perspective and say like, maybe there was. And so like that's sort of the thing that pulls me in. And then you just say like, as time goes on, at the beginning of the movie, they're assassins. So they're assassins for good. And there's also sort of a historical element that I personally find to be really interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think specifically on the comic, for me, I would highlight that I thought it was incredibly well written. I thought that there was a lot of really emotionally honest and real takes on what it would mean to be an immortal and what it would be like. And then you couple that with art that I found to be, it's beautiful, and I'm trying to find better words to describe it. But I want to shout out Leandro Fernández and Daniela Miwa, who did the color. Combined to the effect is really incredible, and I felt like the color was striking throughout. It was like there would be like these really like powerful blues on pages, and then it would shift to orange, and it had had the look of like a cinematographer, in a film, like choosing how to light a scene or something. And then you couple that with characters that I don't know, there were so many cool little details, and I felt like it's particularly Andy was drawn in a way that was meant to evoke someone who might have been around a really long time. And I won't get into like how old Andy is, because I think that is a spoiler, but the look of Andy as drawn looked like somebody who could be very, very old, which I thought was cool.
Right. To talk about color specifically, I like that I like that you mentioned that. I think a cinematographer, depending on the film, typically you're gonna look for realism within the colors and try to make something interesting that feels realistic. And being a comic, I think they leaned into this with the colors and they made it, not realistic, and it worked
stylish.
Because
that would be a word I would use.
Right. Yeah. You're getting blues to describe a panel, and in the same scene, you flip the page, and then there's an orange tinted panel, and like almost everything's orange, and it's like based on sort of what emotion it's sort of trying to evoke, or what is supposed to be specifically like where your eye is supposed to be drawn. Yeah. Things like that. I found to be really interesting in this, and just the use of color in general, and like you said, there's definitely a good eye for cinematography, for photography in general, like framing and what looks most interesting, and how to, you have to use the medium that you're given, whether it's film or comics or whatever it is, and make it interesting to look at, and make, motivated shots, make things like something from way above looking down at the carnage of everything that's just happened, things like that.
Yeah, there was a lot of that, like there was like a bird's eye perspective on scenes sometimes, and I actually thought that was really cool, and tell me if this is not something new, but the idea of like, we'd have like almost an establishing shot of like where we were, and then we'd have multiple little scenes taking place like inside of something that we are looking at. But the sort of establishment would be like a background image that the panels were like over top of. There's just like a lot of cool stuff like that. It was like really clever ways of implying like where things are taking place. I don't know. I just thought it was really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a technique that's been used in comics for a long time. I was
and
wondering...
then you'd see, there was even a panel at one point where you saw the character like appeared twice within the same panel. Like they were here at one point and then they were like doing something else in the foreground, and it sort of implied
movement.
Time had passed within the same... I don't know, there's a lot of cool stuff that might just be basics comic stuff, but like I said, my sort of only other experience with this was Watchmen, which was a sort of very strict on its structure for the most part, and then would occasionally do a splash page. But otherwise was very regimented, whereas this was not. This had like a lot of big stuff and like panels appearing and kind of interesting in different places, and sometimes it would actually branch across both pages.
I was going to ask you about that. So I was worried when, not worried as much because I knew you'd figure it out, but I was thinking about you while I was reading, and I was like, I hope that he understands that like it's not necessarily like a left to right medium at all times. Like there's sometimes that it's
I would get confused sometimes, but like you figure it out. But I was thinking about how there seems to be a reliance on sort of a shared knowledge of how to read a comic that I don't really have. And I remember watching a YouTube video this guy did talking about introducing video games to his girlfriend who had never played video games before. And he like talked about all the things that we take for granted as gamers because like game makers assume you've played a video game before when they make their video games. And like she had never played a video game before. She didn't understand like all these things. And I felt that way. I feel that way a little bit with comics. Like I'm coming in and I'm like, wait, where am I supposed to read? And like sometimes I get a little bit lost, but usually I can kind of muddle my way through it. So if you're like me and you haven't ever read comics and that seems intimidating for you, like just know that you will figure it out, and it's not too bad. And at worst that happens is that you might read something out of order and be a little bit confused and then have to like go back and figure out the way you were supposed to read it.
So specifically with this story, there was something that was it's kind of more of a throwback. But I was wondering how much the sort of boom, 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 bang, 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 bang word bubbles were bothering you throughout, because that was something else that I was like, ooh, this is kind of like a stylistic choice. And I don't know how, like, if you're not familiar with that kind of stuff, because a lot of the time when I see that, it's like, it's almost like I don't know, I kind of just like read by it and like understand that it's there, but it doesn't like, it's not jarring to me. Did you feel any of that? Because I did think maybe you wouldn't like love how much, because there was a lot of it in this story.
There was a lot. There's a lot of gunfire, and they definitely threw up a bunch of the like onomatopoeia kind of words to try and evoke that. And it's very comic book, and it's almost like comic book cliche that I remember seeing in movies where they throw it up on screen and you're like, oh, they're doing the comic book thing.
The old like 60s Batman. Like
exactly.
Pow.
Like I knew what they were doing. And it was okay, and like honestly, like I got the sense that it was just trying to sort of evoke a sound in you, so that like you'd be looking at a panel with like something happening, but then like in the background, words of like gunfire is just filling the entire frame. And I think it was just sort of to imply that the sound is just like overwhelming and deafening, and so
it does work. I think
at times it worked, and then at times I felt a little bit like, I don't know how this. I could have done without it here. I could have just seen the gun firing, and I could have provided the noise myself, I guess. So I guess I was mixed on it a little bit.
Yeah, I figured you would feel that way, but I think it worked. I think if you sit and actually think about it, like you're saying, and you think like bang, bang in your mind, you're actually reading what's being said. Like it does evoke that in your mind, and you're hearing it more than you would necessarily, because it makes you take your time a little more and look at the frame and think about it.
Well, and they were clever with it too. They'd be like they describe it with like different onomatopoetic words to try and really evoke the sound, the specific sound that gun is making in this moment.
Right, like a machine gun sounds different than like a sniper rifle. Sounds different than
So for the most part, it worked for me. I will say that. Yeah. Let's talk about the movie a little bit, spoiler free, and then we can really get into it. But the movie, I thought it was really good. I was really excited to come into this movie after reading the comic, but I was also a little bit like anxious because I really enjoyed the comic, and it was so stylish and cool. And another thing about it, it's sexy. This is a sexy comic, and it's sexy in a way that I think is difficult to do. But I think he does it well, and I think that this is sort of the thing that I would show someone who, because you'll hear from people who are like against quote unquote PC culture, and they'll say things like, "Oh, we can't have fun anymore, we can't be sexy anymore," things like that, right? And I would show them this comic and say like, you can do it, You just have to do it in the right way. And I think this is done the right way. And it's a way that, in my opinion, is inclusive and doesn't necessarily like make anyone feel bad. It doesn't feel like a male gaze to me. It felt like I mean, maybe at times, but like it felt like there was like both gazes were represented. I don't know. It never felt like it was trying to completely over-sexualize the people being presented, yet it was still showing them as being very attractive.
Well, it's like, you know, when I think of like super hyper ridiculous toxic masculine male gaze sort of sexualized shots, I think of like Megan Fox in Transformers, where it's like a you know, low angle tight shot of her butt that goes to her boobs, that goes to her face, and all that.
Well, or in comics, right? Like, people show like how someone might draw like Spider-Woman versus Spider-Man and like the poses they might strike versus, you know what I mean? Right. Like they'll be like bent over in like an anatomically incorrect way to show both their tits and their ass at the same time, and it looks wild. Yeah.
So like I think there's a way there's a way for people to be sexual beings in a story and not have
it's
it
like
be
sex positive instead of exploitative.
Instead of being like exactly. It's not you're not exploiting somebody or objectifying somebody, and just if you have a shot of Megan Fox and you're not doing that, I guarantee people are still going to think that she's attractive. You know what I mean? Like, it's not you don't need to do that to achieve that goal and have like sell sex within the story.
But like, I mean, there's like nudity and people having sex in here, and like, you know what I mean? But it's done in a tasteful way while still being like, clearly this comic's for an adult to read. You know what I mean? I don't know. It's like, I guess I gave it props. And that is one thing that I felt was somewhat missing from the adaptation. I don't think it detracts, but the adaptation, in my opinion, lost most of that sort of sexuality. There was a little bit of it, but for the most part, it was stripped away. We do still get all the violence, though. It's interesting. Like, the violence was kept. It was very sort of bloody in the comic and very bloody in the movie. But there was not a lot of explicit nudity and sex in the movie at all, unless I'm misremembering.
I mean, no, I don't. I think you're right. So I guess to talk about the movie without spoiling, I think that we've talked a little bit about sort of the premise of the story and like what I think is it has a ton of potential within the story. I think there's a lot I think it's a great idea. It's a great jumping off point.
Absolutely. I was going to say, this reminds me of like what I said about Jurassic Park, and I think I've said it about other things. I'm like, this is just a fucking $1 million, $1 billion idea. Like, it's a great idea. And I think really good idea. It's executed really well.
Yeah, and it feels familiar while also feeling fresh and new. And like, I think the interesting takes are being done here. You know, what I felt was holding me up with the adaptation was sort of, we've talked about how hyper stylized the book was, and I felt like this was meant to be like a Charlize Theron like action vehicle, in the same way that there are like action vehicles for male actors. And I think that in I have the same criticism with those movies, where it's very much centered on the action within the story. And, you know, I think there are great moments of character within this. I think added scenes of characterization, like showing characters and how they feel about each other and, you know, why they feel that way, because these are ancient beings. I think those scenes still work. And I think there's enough here for me to sort of want a sequel, if there is to be a sequel, to see sort of if they can pull off the potential of the story even more than this does. But I do think this was really centered on like delivering an action movie with Charlize Theron leading. And honestly, like, a lot of the action wasn't as interesting as I would have hoped. I think that it's interesting combat. I just think that, and I could tell that the actors had great choreography. I could tell that there was really big set pieces that they had set up, and I think they were paying off basically beat for beat what was happening in the comic. But something about sort of the style of the camera work didn't work as well for me as sort of as the comic book did.
It's tough. I mean, I didn't really have that criticism, but I can see what you're saying, and I think it's kind of like we're spoiled for action a little bit, because we've seen like John Wick now. Like, we've seen action done at such a level that the bar is so high, right, for action to surprise us and to do something that we're like, oh, I haven't seen that before. Like, it's so difficult to do that. And I thought the action was good and enjoyable, but yeah, I mean, it maybe doesn't quite reach that height, right? Of like some of the best action movies out there that you'll see with just super crisp choreography everywhere that is surprising and interesting. Like it was like just like a half step behind that. You know,
what I would say is like I know that they put in the work. Like I could see that it was Charlize Theron doing the stunts. You know what I mean? I could see that they were doing the actual choreography there, and I applaud them for that. But it was something about the way that it all came together that it just felt like sort of a lot of we literally just talked about this in Princess Bride when we were talking about the combat and sort of like what it looks like to have like lockdown open shots in combat. And like this had moments of that, but a lot of the combat just happened to be like flash tight shot of a gun, like punches and things like that. And there were the moments of actual stunts being done, which I do think was good. And like you said, you know, it's hard to like walk in and say like compare this to John Wick, because like you said, the bar is really high. And I think that, like you said, it is like it's right there. But what I think where it falls for me is that this is a action movie first. Like it's to me, it was pitched as an action movie. Like I'm looking at the trailer, it looks like Charlize Theron in action, and seeing her in something like Atomic Blonde, and then seeing her in this movie, I just feel like it's a difference in combat. But I will say, like, sort of the premise is more interesting to me than Atomic Blonde. So like these sort of characters that care about each other and like have been through a lot together, and so even some of the changes I think were smart from the comic as well to sort of create more tension. Which
we'll get into when we get into spoilers, which we're going to get into soon. But just in general, I want to... So while I agree with you about the action, for me, the action was never the point. I think I maybe I didn't... Because I don't know that I ever saw the trailer for this. I honestly didn't know a lot about it going in. I'd only seen people reacting to it online. And for me, after reading the comic, I was just excited about the story and seeing the characters and their relationships.
I have one thing I wanted to say real quick. I did watch the movie before I read the book. In this case. Yeah, I should have said that earlier on.
Okay, so that is going to change your experience. That's really interesting. Yes, because I went in after having read the comic and was really excited to see what they were going to do with the characters. And I was sort of delighted by the extra details we got for a lot of them. I don't know. I had a great time with this movie, and I watched it with my wife, who had not read the comic at all and had not ever heard of the Old Guard, not just seen a trailer. I just told her, let's watch this movie, and she's like, okay. She loved it. She had a great time, and she was like, you know, really into the premise, thought it was a really cool idea, thought like the characters were all super interesting, like the idea that all 5 of these characters would have these rich backstories and really interesting interpersonal relationships. And that's what carries the movie for me. That's what makes this a notable movie that I would recommend to people. I think you go in for the story and for the characters, and then the added bonus is it's got good action, if not the best action you've seen.
Right. And I think I would be willing to say, like, yeah, I agree with that, because like I said, I think there's enough here for me to want to see a sequel, to pay off sort of what I feel like the potential of the story is. Going into the movie, I thought that it was going to be a fully just like an action movie, sort of like nonstop. All it is action, with like the premise of like they can't die. I think the thing that pulled me in and made me think, like I said earlier, I would want to see a sequel was, like you said, the characters and how they work together, and the sort of just that tight-knit story of, you know, they're the only ones watching their backs. And I think it did a great job of setting up Nile, a new character. And like, I want to see more of her as well. So, you know, like I said, I want to see the sequel to this. I don't know. I was expecting, I think the hype may have gotten to me as well. Like I thought there was like a lot, I think going into this,
I might have
hyped
it up to you too much, because it was like me passing along hype to you.
Right. Well, you did. And then I was like starting to see little stuff here and there about it. And I was like, oh boy, here we go. Mm-hmm. This is going to be like the next massive thing.
I mean, it sounds like you liked it, but maybe weren't as taken with it as I was.
I wouldn't say I loved it. That's how I'll leave it, you know.
Okay, that's fair. Let's move into spoiler talk. But first, I want to talk about Greg Rucka a little bit. So first off, Greg Rucka also wrote the screenplay for the Old Guard film. So it is very much like what we just talked about with Princess Bride. It is a cohesive sort of creative vision there. He is an American comic book writer, screenwriter, and novelist. known for his work on well-known comics such as Action Comics, Batwoman, Detective Comics, the DC Comics miniseries Superman, World of New Krypton, and as well for creating Image Comics series Lazarus and novels such as Atticus, Kodiak series. He also wrote the screenplay for The Old Guard based on his comic series of the same name. And this guy is prolific. Lots of comics, lots of novels. He's written like a dozen novels or more, and tons of different comics. A lot of well-known, speaking of just like Marvel and DC, like lots of well-known properties I'm seeing on his list here. So really an impressive guy who's fairly young. I mean, he was born in 1969, so he's 50 years old approximately. One cool thing I also saw, lives in Portland, Oregon.
Oh, wow. Cool.
Isn't that cool? Yeah, funny. So fellow Portlander, maybe I'll see him one of these days at something. It's possible.
Yeah. I found something in my research that I wanted to run by you. I read that, so Greg Rucka wrote the first draft of the screenplay, and then Charlize Theron came aboard. And then she had a bunch of issues with it, apparently. They were raised in a conference call. These issues were raised with Theron in the conference call and Rucka. And afterwards, Rucka was quoted as saying it was one of the worst experiences of his career. He did another rewrite after that, but was fired. Theron's production company commissioned a new script from new writers, but Netflix hated that version. And then when Gina Prince-Bythewoods came aboard, she recommissioned Rucka, who was able to patch up his differences with Theron.
Wow. No, I didn't see that. The thing I had seen was about Gina Prince-Bythewoods and how she had a huge... I listened to him talk about how she had like a ton of enthusiasm for the project, and he felt like it really came alive in her hands because she was so excited about it. And he was excited to work with her on it. So it sounded like those two visions really lined up. I didn't see that about Charlize Theron, so I'm interested. So are we in spoilers now? I guess we are, right? One of the major changes in this version is that Andy becomes essentially mortal in the movie version. And I was wondering if that was a forced change by her, because she might not be wanting to commit to future version, to a series of movies or something, which seems like this is going to be a series of comics. It was like giving her an out instead of making her an eternal character.
Maybe I do think it works for the story though, because that's a change that I actually liked. I think we can get more into that when we really start to dig in.
I was very surprised by it because, like I said, I read the comic first, where that isn't. Yeah,
I watched the movie first and was expecting it to happen in the comic, and then it never did.
Yeah,
which I understand from a comic perspective to continue to go on for a really long time, and that's also an interesting decision that was made with this to have it be clearly it's not a show, it's a movie.
Yeah.
Whereas Netflix loves to make shows out of things. So I think that's also something interesting to think about. Is like what does this look like as a show? Probably a little more dragged out. And
sure.
You would need more than just this first volume.
You could probably do like a mini series for each chapter, do an hour-long episode, something like that. You could get even more into the characters. I think it would have worked, but I think it worked as a movie, honestly. I mean, it's hard to speculate on like what the changes were that she wanted, and then like we don't know because it sounds like they didn't end up going with a lot of them, and they patched it over and found a middle ground, and so it's tough to say.
It's possible that Prince-Bythewood wanted the change to sort of create tension within the story as well.
Yeah,
because
I don't know that it was this change though. That's just one I've noticed, right? Like that's one of the biggest ones that stands out to me, right?
Yeah, it is a change. So it's like we're going to talk about it regardless of who it was that made the decision.
So let's focus on the comic a little bit before we get to the movie and all the differences. In the comic, there was a particular panel that I wanted to read, or a couple of panels, I guess, passage that I wanted to read, because I thought it was kind of like the emotional core of what this story is about. And I found it really striking. So it's when Niall, who is the new immortal, is being brought in, and she's in the car with Booker and Andy. And she has been told to ask Booker like why she can't see her family. And then Booker tells her why. This is what he says. "You will watch all of them die, Niall. You will watch everyone you have loved pass away. And if you try to touch their lives, they will ask questions. And through your answers, they will learn your secret. And they will ask you to share it with them, and you will not be able to. And they will curse your name. They will beg, they will implore. They will not believe you when you say you cannot help them. And in desperation, they will do things to forever taint your memory of them, and they will still die. And so they will grow desperate, and you will never forget what they became before they did. I really like that because I feel like I've heard this before, right? Like, and I've never been particularly convinced by other versions of this argument, right? Like, yeah, it would suck to see someone you love grow old and die. Like, that would suck. Obviously, it would be sad. But the idea of them turning on you and like it tainting your memory of them because they wouldn't believe you when you told them that you can't give it to them, and their desperation over that. And that and one other passage, which I won't read in its entirety just because it's actually longer than that, were like just really struck me. And that was the scene in the armored car between Joe and Nikki, and where Joe professes his love for Nikki, and they're sort of getting a moment where the soldiers around them are like, he makes a joke like, "What is he, your boyfriend?" And then he just goes off on him and describes this like epic immortal love they have. And I love that scene. I thought it was excellent, and I was so happy to see that like basically word for word in the adaptation as well.
Yeah, I mean, you can see that, like I said, this is the things that I like about the premise, is this idea of it puts the reader in a situation, or the watcher in a situation, where you sit and you think like, okay, what would it be like to lose everyone I loved? You know, this is a wish fulfillment story, and in certain ways, I think the idea of immortality, people yearn for in some ways, and they're like, how cool would it be to be unkillable and all these things? But like, you know, you think about how tortured you would be, and like what the effect would be, like you said, if you couldn't save the people you loved, and then they came to despise you and said things that they wish that, you know, that in their darkest moments they said things to you that would scar your memory of them forever.
If they turned on you and didn't believe you and hated you. Like,
right. And just think about psychologically, like the kind of issues you develop over millennia. You know what I mean? Like we live for 100 years maybe. Yeah. And like, think about all the stuff that PTSD that people develop over their lifetime and things like that they go through. And like just what all of that would bring about, and how emotionally just like scarred you would be. And that's the kind of stuff that the story does well, is bringing up those ideas to us mortals who could never, you know, contend or even imagine what it would be like. And and then also, you know, that goes to show and inform the love that Joe and Nikki have, and how we literally can't even comprehend it because we're infants in comparison. You know, we could
I did
never
like
know.
how in the adaptation that was sort of turned on, like it was said outright by Booker, like, you can't understand because you have each other. You can't understand how alone we are. And I thought that was powerful, and I liked that it was, because I think that's implied in the comic, but like, you know, comics don't have as much words usually. Like, it's a lot more subtext, I think. And I think that is implied by what happened. But I like that it was sort of spelled out in the adaptation, because I think it's a powerful note to land there. And it is very different for them, right? To have this sort of immortal love that is still burning bright, and versus the idea of being alone forever like that, like never being able to form a lasting relationship. Powerful. But so I do want to also touch on my criticism I had of the comic, because I feel like I've been like very over the top in my praise, because I did really, really like this comic. One thing that I did find, though, was in the third act, I'll call it, when they are sort of going to the final confrontation with Merrick. I think, is his name Merrick in both versions?
I thought it was just Farmer Bro something or other.
Yeah, Farmer Bro. Yeah, exactly. Tech Bro, Farmer Bro. And it's funny because I was like, this guy is just kind of like boring as a villain. He's kind of like corny. He's kind of cheesy. He's kind of like super tropey. But I liked in the comic in particular where it felt like he actually wasn't the villain. Like, the villain was actually more Booker, but then he gets redeemed. And I love the way the comic ended, and the movie ended too. But Booker, you know, betrays them, and then is sentenced to 100 years of solitude at the end. And I thought that was really powerful. And I liked that it was like the focus of the villain was actually it was like that guy was just beside the point. Like, he's one in a million. Like, there's going to be more of these guys. Let's not worry about it. It was more about Booker and his betrayal. I think that is like the most memorable piece of that final act. And then everything surrounding this pharma bro, I felt like it was kind of expected, and it kind of happened really fast in the comic, and then it was over. And it was cool. Like, there was a lot of cool scenes in there. But I don't know, like, everything else had felt so fresh and interesting. I wanted something a little different at the end, and I felt like the movie delivered a little more of that than the comic did. So I'll give credit there.
I think maybe I was putting too much on just the movie in my criticism. I think you're digging into some of the things that I was trying to highlight with saying the things that I liked about the story. So I highlighted the idea of the historic elements, and I think the relationship between the characters is the strong point. And then sort of this premise is so rich, and to just like kind of have the sort of conflict in this story be so, like you said, predictable in ways, and have it be this farmer bro that really doesn't matter. And yeah, maybe the Booker situation does kind of redeem it in ways, but I found that's why I'm like, oh, I want more of this story, because there's so much potential here to have really interesting stories.
Yeah. It feels like the opening. I mean, it's called, what is this? Book 1, Opening Fire. And that's what it feels like. It feels like there is more story to be told here, and I would assume it could go to new heights, because I think there's room for this to go to even greater heights, in my opinion. And I know Volume 2 exists; it's out there. So I want to read it, honestly. So whether we cover it or not, I want to read it.
Yeah, I mean, Charlize Theron said she would be game for a sequel, and like cool. After a little bit of time has gone on and everything.
Yeah.
So
well, it was popular,
I think
too.
and just to like jump ahead a little bit, this was watched by 70 million people on Netflix over the course of the first few weeks, and making it one of the most...
Yeah, I'll do a sequel.
Making it one of the top 10 most successful things to Netflix originals.
Yeah.
So like there's a lot of people eyes on this, and I think there's a lot of good that will come of it. And I think with that much attention, that much more attention will be poured into a sequel, sort of marketing wise, budget wise, the things that they can do. And I felt like there was something in this film, and this is, I guess I'm starting to transition us into the film a little bit.
Not yet. I want to talk about the comics a little bit more.
Let me just say this one thing, and I'll
okay.
and I'll stop. It did feel sort of like a Netflix TV movie. You know what I mean? There were times that I felt like it couldn't bridge into like movies.
Yeah, I didn't feel that way. I don't know, man. I think the fact that you're watching it on Netflix on a TV might be affecting you too much. This felt like a big budget movie to me.
No, it felt like something I could see on TV. That's not. It took place in a lot of boardrooms and a lot of like small hallways.
I will say the sets. That's the one place I'll agree. It felt like they did not go for the most expensive sets and sort of like big. And I'll be interested to see with the popularity of this, if maybe it gets a bigger budget next time.
That's what I think will happen. And I think I'll be very excited to see that, because they had some great establishing shots.
They did go to a lot of locations, it felt like.
Right, there's a lot of great establishing shots. And then we're in sort of dark rooms and hallways and like, you know what I mean? Like we're in a lot of rooms, I would say.
Yeah, I could see that. Especially at the end. There's a lot of like, they went to a house and then they went to a building that was kind of nondescript, and it was a lot of hallways and stuff, like you said. Yeah, I'll give you that.
Let's finish up the comic book, and then I'll talk about the film.
I just wanted to say one more thing about the comic. There was a particular thing they did several times I thought was really cool, and it was this like fading to bright, like to white. It was like a fade to white at the end of like different scenes.
One shot specifically that I feel like you're also talking about is the one where when Niall dies for the first time, and is shot and is laying down, and her body is sort of fading to white in the comic in the panel.
In the panel. Anyway, I don't know if that's like something they do all the time or not, but I just thought it was really cool. It was effective.
I mean, I don't know that I've seen that specific thing before, so maybe it is new to this, but it's definitely a effective stylistic choice to like sort of show someone's life fading off the page. Like that's really cool.
Okay, now we can get into the movie. Yeah, so I mean, I really enjoyed this movie. I like that. I said it before. I really like to see certain scenes. Like even that passage I did read, for the most part, was in this movie. They showed some cool stuff with Booker, like walking out of a hospital or something where he had interacted with somebody. And I thought that was effective. It didn't quite hit the same note for me, like as powerful a note, I guess, as it did in the comic, but it might have been because it was a rehash of something I'd already read. Whereas when I read it in the comic, I thought it was really powerful. And then the love between Joe and Nikki and the armored truck scene, I thought was just fantastically just brought to life. It's one of those moments where I was just so happy to see something make the transition and yet retain all of its heart.
Yeah, while we're talking about differences, I do want to jump in to talk about something I loved from the movie that was a change from the book. So in the book, I think it's very clear that I think her name changes from book to movie, but in the movie her name is like Quyen, and she's the character that Andy finds first. Andy's been an immortal for a long time, and then she finds Quinn. And this is the character that in the book, I think she has a different name, but this is the character that in the movie eventually would be separated because they were being like sort of tortured for being witches, and then she would be thrown in the Iron Maiden and thrown in the ocean.
Yeah.
So I think on the page in the book, it's sort of said that she like jumps off the ship or falls off the ship or something like that, and she's never seen again.
I don't even know this is the same character. So yeah, there's an interesting sort of I don't know if this character was an invention for the movie.
I suspect it's from Volume 2.
That's just, as I was going to say, it might be a Volume 2 thing that is being brought into this for like consistency's sake. But yeah, because when the character is mentioned who drowned and then they like knew it was their time, it's kind of just said and then glossed over and then never talked about again.
Right, which is leaving the door open.
Whereas in the movie, like we spend a lot of time talking about that.
Yeah.
And I thought that was great. Like the idea of
horrific and scary and like
terrifying.
Great addition.
Yeah, the idea of just like waking up and drowning over and over again for 500 years and it driving you insane, like that's powerful stuff. So I like that. I like that change. I suspect it's something from Volume 2. That's my guess.
Yeah. Which brings me back to the things I love about this the most are when we flash back and we see some of the crazy stuff that went on and some of the intrigue that's gone on before the story. Like, I think this story is great. This story is great for setting up a world. I think it's got a super rich history, and I think it's got a super rich future. And I'm really excited to see more of that on either end of the spectrum there. But let's talk about the filmmaker a little bit, because this is kind of a big deal. I wanted you to hear this.
Okay.
So Gina Prince-Bythewoood is an American film director and screenwriter. She is known for directing the films Love and Basketball, 2000, The Secret Life of Bees, 2008, Beyond the Lights, 2014, and The Old Guard, 2020. And recently, we actually added The Secret Life of Bees to our list, right, of stuff that we might cover in the future.
Potential projects. Yeah, that's a cool one. Yeah, we were like considering that one heavily for a while. I think it ended up losing out to the Beale Street adaptation we did,
which has another interesting connection.
Okay.
What's the Beale Street connection? Did you figure it out or realize it at all?
No, I don't know it.
Okay, so Kiki Lane, who plays Nile, is the main actress from If Beale Street Could Talk.
Oh, you're right. Jesus. Yeah, that's wild. She looks so familiar. I couldn't place it. That's so funny.
Yeah. I was so excited when I saw that. I was like, "Oh my God, we just saw her."
That's so cool. No, you're totally right. You're totally right.
So really cool to see her again. I want to talk about Gina Prince-Bythewoood right now, though. So Love and Basketball, I remember seeing that when it came out, and it was massive. Mm-hmm. Well, I was reading that it won best first screenplay at the Independent Spirit Awards. It grossed like $30 million or something like that. It was a huge hit for her, and it became like one of the most popular basketball films of all time. So she like to kick off her career with that and win all these like sort of indie film awards and like to go around and be admired in that way was really cool. And then to see this follow through, she's directed a lot for television. She directed I think she directed the pilot of Cloak and Dagger, which is another comic book sort of material. But something that I found in my research is that she's the first Black female director to direct a big budget superhero. This is considered superhero, so big budget superhero film.
Interesting. It's a weird fit for superhero. I contend still that it's like it's definitely like got a foot in the space. You know, it's definitely kind of.
I mean, people are considering it as far as like landmark moments. People are considering it a landmark moment for Black female.
I want to give it to her, so I'm happy there. The movie, it almost feels reductive to call this a superhero movie. in some way.
I can see that, but I mean, the only reason that I push back against that because I feel like people have this idea of what a superhero movie is, and like they can be so much more than that, and like that's why I'm like, this is definitely a superhero movie.
But are they heroes? Like, I mean, like.
It's a genre though. It's not about like the words within it. It's like a genre. It's like at this point they have superpowers, right? So
they're immortal. That is basically it. I mean, it is cool. One of the things I love about this, I'm not. I mean, I know you're telling me about the filmmaker, but I love the idea of like if you could just live as long as Andy lives, the amount of knowledge that you would accrue over time would, in and of itself, be a superpower. She would be like a demigod. And I loved the line that was not in the comic where she said, I was worshipped as a god at one point, which I loved because this is the kind of thing you could totally see happening. And yeah, like just the knowledge you would accrue would make you almost into a demigod, which is pretty cool to think about.
The brushes that she has with famous artists through history and like the people that they've known.
It's implied that she had more than just a brush with a lot of them, which is pretty cool. Well, and that was something big in the comic. It was like she slept with a lot of people over the ages, and that was not really touched on much in the adaptation.
She even was like, I remember a quote from the book where she said like she slept with, entire populations and things like that, and the experiences just to encompass
over time. You would
just to encompass the amount of experiences that you would amass over thousands and thousands of years.
Well, and she's like always searching for like feeling, right? So it seems like it makes sense that this would be something she would do. I think something anyone would do in this situation. And because you can't have a lasting long-term relationship, so what you can do is have very short, one-night stand type deals, or maybe even slightly longer. You could have a lot of them, but they always would have to be. You couldn't let them grow into anything bigger because of the reason that Booker outlined, right? Like, so you'd have to avoid that. There is also a really cool section that is it touched on at all in the movie? I don't think so. Where she talks about, it kind of is. She talks about maybe having a love with someone else, but there was a really cool section in the comic where she essentially has this love of her life for a while that grows old, and then she eventually has to leave because they become worried that people are going to ask too many questions. But I thought it was a really cool, just like little background story about.
Yeah, that was cool.
And over the course of her life, of course, there was a time in which she had this great love that is now long gone. Like,
because eventually she would try it out. You know what I mean? Exactly. Even though she knows how bad it would hurt, she would need. She's like, oh yeah,
I know, I've been there. I had this great love of my life, and that was 150 years ago.
And then that's not even to mention Lycan, who is the other immortal. So she finds like Quinn, and then she finds Lycan, and Lycan's like the first one of the immortals to be killed in battle, and actually stayed.
I don't think he appears in the comic at all, but in volume 1,
no, he does.
He does?
Yeah, it's very brief. It's very brief. No. He died the similar way. He died in combat, and then
okay, I missed that. Anyway, my point being that like one of the things that I'm excited for like a volume 2 about is like I feel like there's infinite amount of other little stories like this you could get. Right.
Yeah. I mean, this is like I remember like early Assassin's Creed. People, Assassin's Creed revolutionized sort of gaming of that time period for like climbing and searching and missions and sneaking and a lot of this stuff.
Sure.
But the thing that I remember a lot is like, oh my God, I get to go get weapons made by Leonardo da Vinci. You know what I mean? Like those are the things that I loved about that series and like going through history. And so like getting to see Andy interact with Jesus, like I thought Jesus was going to be mentioned in some way, right? Like an immortal. How could that? I just thought that was it was so close to being a Jesus reference somewhere in here. Like, oh, Jesus, yeah, I knew him. I don't know, is he still around right now? Is he immortal? Like, we're immortal. You know what I mean? I think so there could have been a commentary there, but maybe they just didn't want to jump into that territory and have a bunch of
probably not
religious people upset with them.
One of the changes that I really liked, and this is something my wife actually pointed out, and I remember remembering it because I was like, that was new. Copley had a really cool connection to Pharma Bro, with it being about his wife who had ALS and wanting to save her. And that character was so much more likable and relatable in the film version than the Copley we got in the comic book. And I think it was all achieved through this like pathos or whatever that this character had, right? Like this is a deep emotional core and reason for doing things. And it made the character way more interesting to me in a way, whereas Copley was somewhat forgettable, in my opinion, in the comic.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Chiwetel Ejiofor, like whoever he plays in any movie, you're gonna remember, and you're gonna be like, holy shit, I love him.
Exactly. Yeah.
I agree. I think the thing that I love about Copley specifically in the movie, it's in the the novel as well, or the comic as well. He's tracking them. He betrays them per se, and ultimately he finds purpose for these immortals who've been looking for purpose for thousands of years. And I did think, I don't know how much that was touched on in the comic, but like that idea.
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't have that same like I'm gonna help you that he gets tasked with in the movie. That was definitely different. I don't know if they go there in Volume 2 or not. And it's cool though because this is all Greg Rucka. You know what I mean? It wasn't like someone came in and wrote a screenplay for his material and just like went roughshod. You know what I mean? It was he was doing this. So whenever that happens, it's kind of like The Expanse, right? Like what we talked about with that, like it's being written by the same people who write the novels. So there's sort of a blending of the canon. So even if that doesn't occur in the comics, it's still sort of part of the same canon. It's just like a different medium.
I think because of that moment, like giving them purpose, seeing that like, oh, these people they've been saving have been down generations later, they're sort of like automatically going to affect culture in some ways, society and better society. I think it's a more neat way to say like, okay, like this is the arc of the characters. Now they understand their mission and now they can go out and perform it more. And I would assume, like you said, Rucka was setting this up in the script, in the screenplay, because he was planning on doing it in the continuation of his story. Maybe. I would assume.
Or it could be a chance to revise, coming in and do the adaptation. Yeah. Hey, let's revise it and add something different.
Yeah. Let's talk about a couple changes really quickly though. So what did you think ultimately, full spoilers and everything, about the change to make Andy mortal?
It did add an urgency. It added a real sense of danger for the character at the end. It made us worry about her. So in that sense, I liked it. It did a little bit take away the badass factor, though, because we didn't get to see Andy in sort of her full immortal demigod mode that we get at the end of the comic, where she really shines and shows like just how formidable she would be. We get a little bit of that in the movie, but the fact that she all of a sudden just lost it, and I don't know, they tied it into the idea of like maybe she lost her regenerative power when Niall became immortal, or it was somehow tied to that. I obviously couldn't have been one for one because she died after that, but I guess that makes sense. But for me, it felt too convenient a little bit. I guess because it was a big change and I knew that. I remember going like, well, what? So she just lost it, out of the blue after 6,000 years for no real reason that we're going to outline.
Well, it seems like that's like what they're destined to do, right? Like eventually they die. That's the point. Like,
I don't know. Like we just met this character and then all of a sudden it happens to her. Like it just felt it felt early to me. Like I felt like eventually I expect the comic is going to go there, but I didn't expect it to happen in this first movie. It felt too soon. Yeah.
I think for a movie, it makes sense to increase the stakes like that, right? Like crank the stakes to as high as you possibly can, put a ticking time clock in place. And, like I remember at the beginning, and you have to remember, like I watched the movie first. So like I thought that this was sort of the arc of the character anyway. But I started the movie like, oh my God, they're badasses. They're just going to tear through everybody. And then very soon we learned this idea that they drop their immortality eventually just out of the blue. They don't come back sometime. And there's many, many times where I was because I think some of my favorite stuff in this movie is between Joe and Nikki. I loved Joe and Nikki's connection, like the love, all of that stuff, even like reading it straight off the page.
And how cool is it to put a male-male relationship, right, like front and center, and make that the eternal love and be unapologetic about it. So cool.
I love that. Yeah, I love it. And the thing I also was like, oh my God, they're gonna break our hearts. They're gonna one of them is gonna be, you know what I mean? The stakes that were set up for me, I was like, one of them's losing their immortality. The headshot, like the moment, the gun in the mouth and the headshot when there was both fighting one enemy, I thought for sure, whichever the one that got shot, I was like, oh my God, he's gone and I'm gonna be devastated. And I was just like being that invested in the characters, having not spent that much time with them, I was like, I love these characters. So I really enjoyed seeing these characters and starting to understand the world. And I like I said, I really want more of this. I want more.
So I want you to tell me what the experience was like, because this is a unique experience to you now. What was it like coming from the movie and going to the comic and seeing the style of the comic? Like, how did that strike you?
So coming from the movie, like I already had I knew the things I liked and I knew the things I didn't like from the story. And I was like, okay, so is this an adaptation thing, or is this going to be like how the story plays out? Am I going to feel very similarly? I ultimately felt very similarly about both mediums, with a few changes here and there. And I just did think of this. I wanted to say it really quickly. Another thing that kept making me think of a TV movie is there was a lot of, and you know, I don't want to dig too much into this, but basically I felt like there were a lot of very on the nose things that kept happening. So if there was a battle that was happening, there would be music with lyrics in sort of a poppy, sort of trendy song would be playing. And the lyrics of the song would be like, we're going to fight really hard. We're going to like a lot of this. We're in place of where I would normally want there to be a score. And there was like multiple scenes I felt like were undercut by songs with lyrics. And I don't think that, you know, I'm not against songs with lyrics in movies, because clearly there are some that do it very well. But I kept thinking about just how on the nose some of these songs were.
It's so subjective, because I'm sort of in the middle. Like, I can see what you're saying. I can see, like, I can feel like the missing of like an iconic score, right? That was like, oh, you know, I love a score where you can identify like, oh, that's from that movie, right? If there was an Old Guard score that you heard and you're like, that's Old Guard, it's really iconic, that's really cool. Obviously, that's great. But one of the things my wife said immediately is, wow, the soundtrack for this is so good. And so it's going to be subjective, like, because I think some people are going to really like the soundtrack of this movie.
It is going to be subjective. To me, it feels like a music video. To me, it feels like a fun music video. You got lyrics, you got music, things are happening, and it's like a fun action scene, and that's just how it feels to me. So like that was something that like rubbed me the wrong way, and whether that's just me subjectively, my state of mind on it. That's just,
that's what we're doing. We're giving our subjective opinions, right? Like that's the exercise. But I mean, people will disagree, I'm sure.
And I'm not even saying I didn't like the songs. They were good songs. They were cool songs.
I mean, I think you called it poppy trash, but
if I hear it on the radio, I'm gonna crank it up. You know what I mean? I'd be like, oh, this is kind of a fun, cool song. It just like felt like, I don't know. It just felt like it was sort of undercutting it in ways to me.
Right.
But continuing into the movie more, I wanted to talk about Andy is Andromache,
yeah,
of Scythians.
The Scythian.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Scythians?
No. Okay,
so this is where I'm going with it, because I was like, I don't know what a Scythian is. I want to figure out what's going on here. So I went and did some digging. Scythians are known from about the 7th century BC up until the 3rd century BC. They were a group of ancient tribes of nomadic warriors who originally lived in what is now southern Siberia. Their culture flourished from around 900 BC to around 200 BC, by which time they had extended their influence all over Central Asia, from China to the northern Black Sea.
Cool. Well, and like I was saying, I was saying this earlier, and I didn't want to get into spoilers, but like she has kind of the look of, in the comic at least, of like an ancient man. You know what I mean? The way they draw like her face and her nose and stuff. I thought it was cool because it like evokes a little bit of that like almost like Cro-Magnon look, while still not, you know, obviously she's still like a super attractive character, but they were able to achieve a look of like, if that exact character is lifted and put in a panel of, we're going to show you a scene from, you know, 2,000 years before Christ, and I'm going to believe that this is the kind of person that might have been walking around back then. Whereas when you take Charlize Theron and you put her in that scene, sometimes it's like, So that's just like struggle when, you know, you're using human beings that were born recently. It's going to be very difficult to do that.
Yeah, you just made me think of something else. I like that they're rocking their sort of they're literally equipped with their weapons.
Oh, fucking yeah! How cool is that?
The tradition. That's so badass. That's so cool.
And that reminds me of the other thing I love so much about Joe and Nikki. The idea that they were on both sides of the crusade, killed each other, and that's how they found each other. Like, it's such a fucking
like
cool. Fated moment. Yeah, and I think they're the one who says like everything happens for a reason, so it would make sense that they would believe that. And that also just makes me really like Booker as a character, even though he is sort of the villain here, but because he is he's alone, and his backstory of like being hung and being part of the Napoleon army and all this stuff, like I thought that was all really cool. Like seeing him frozen in the comic, I thought was a really memorable passage.
Yeah, I think that's something I appreciated after watching the movie too. With the comic is like I've said multiple times now, the historic elements, we got even more of them in the comic, and sort of got to like and maybe it was just that I got to really look at each panel and take my time with it. But seeing him like in battle in the Napoleonic Wars and then retreat, like running away as a coward and then being found, and like that brought a lot to Booker. And it's like, okay, so he's not opposed to doing the immoral thing, which then goes to inform him betraying them. Yeah, eventually, you know what I mean? He ran so. There's a lot of good character building that goes on in a lot of the historical
It did remind
elements.
me of a note I took, though. I felt like his betrayal didn't go far enough in the comic. I was like, what was his plan? Because his plan, like, is terrible in the comic. Like, he shoots Andy, and he's like, haha, I betrayed you. And then she, like, gets the gun from him and beats him up. And then he's like, well, I've lost. And I was like, that was the plan? You had to know that was going to happen.
It was always sort of a half-hearted, like, half-cocked, like, plan anyway, because like realistically, like he wanted them to finally die was his whole thing, and it's like
he was hoping that they would be able to figure out a way to kill them. It seemed
right, but like you would think like everyone else seems like they're like Andy, Nikki, and Joe all seem like they're like, yeah, it's not scientific really. It's sort of just like we're not supposed to die yet thing. Right. So like once you're supposed to die, you'll die. So it's like sort of leaving it open.
Right, but I mean, I don't think any of them know for certain, and I could definitely see Booker as someone who doesn't believe that.
Right, because he's like sort of more technical and more advanced and more modern. But yeah, that like they're very much, I think, in the boat of like when we're supposed to die, we're supposed to die, and he's like the one who's like.
Oh, that was one small change I wanted to touch on and see what your thoughts were. In the comic, all of them, other than Booker and Nile, are terrible with tech and like can't figure it out and like are behind the times. Whereas in the movie, it felt like that wasn't really a thing. Like they, for the most part, seem to be with it.
In the movie, I remember like thinking, how the hell? I know, like, you know, I know they would probably have the time to be good at everything, but like, would they actually have the interest to be good at everything? Right. And then in the story in the comic, it was explained like, no, they don't give it. Like, a bunch of them like are not interested in learning anything new.
Yeah, Andy's like, get the tape or whatever it is you do with that thing. Like, she not even like thinking about the fact that it could be broadcasting live and stuff.
Which makes more sense to me from a character standpoint, like a 6,000-year-old character.
I agree. I love that stuff. I've always liked that with like ancient immortal vampires and stuff. If they like struggle to use a phone and stuff, I love that because it's like in that sense they're like a grandparent who is like this new technology confuses me.
Yeah. The mystery of Andy's age, like sort of is answered in the comic, is not answered in the movie. Right. In the comic, she says like I'm 6,000 something years old, so 4,000 BC. We could assume. I like the mystery before in the movie. Like I kind of was hoping they wouldn't say it in the comic because I like that idea of like
Well, I mean, 6,000 years old is like as old as you can imagine. Like it's like you could like that's as old as people were people at a certain point. You know what I mean? Like before that.
Well, it's like basically I believe that's like where recorded history began was like 4,000 BC. So it's like I don't know how much further back realistically you could go and make it believable.
So 6,000 was a big enough number to me where I felt like satisfied when I heard that number. I was like, holy shit. You know what I mean? Like that's really, really old. Like she was 4,000 years old before Christ was born. You know what I mean? Like that's wild. Super cool, and I love that character. They just so I would read so much about just her throughout the ages and like the things she's
I know into. I can't. That's what I want. I'm ready for it. I want more. I want to see Andy in the history.
I think that's what's taken me about the story that makes me love it is the characters and the conceit and the idea. And then I think having read the comic first gave me a really strong foundation heading into the movie that I could kind of fall back on. So one last thing I wanted to talk about is one of the big differences that I see is that you have to make a decision, in my opinion, when you're adapting a comic book to a film. And this is something we've seen done in many different ways, right? There's like the Marvel way of doing it. There's, many different DC ways of doing it. And then you have something like a Sin City or like a Watchmen, or many others where it's like hyper stylized, right? Like, so I feel like there's a decision that has to be made when you're doing it. Another one I just thought of is Scott Pilgrim. Isn't that one where like it felt like a comic book, like the way it was made. So I feel like you make a decision of like how comic booky are we going to be with this, and it felt like they made a decision to not go super strong in the comic book feel. Like there was when they did some of the title cards for like different locations, it looked like it came out of a comic book. So there was a couple of like homages, but it didn't feel like they were doing a ton of like we're gonna give it the feel of a comic book. And then, once again, the color was so striking in the comics, it didn't feel like there was a lot of attention to that in the movie. Like, it didn't feel like they were trying to, cast certain scenes and some sort of dramatic lighting, colorized lighting. It was like they made a decision to make it more realistic looking. How did you feel about that change?
That's the thing about adapting comics. Like, people have been talking about this for since Tim Burton's Batman, since, Christopher Reeves as Superman. Like, how campy, and not even campy, but like, how comic booky are you willing to go? And I think we've seen that audiences are interested and more open to grounded superheroes. So we get Christopher Nolan's Batman movies that are very grounded. And then we get, then we come into the age of where we're starting to do like Iron Man. That's a pretty grounded Marvel movie.
Yeah.
But as time goes on, audiences are being trusted to be open to more fully comic booky movies. Because as soon as you start to get into like Ant-Man, and you start to get into Guardians of the Galaxy, and you started to get into Thor Ragnarok, those are not the same kind of comic book movies as like a grounded Iron Man. Those are colorful, poppy movies, crazy creatures, like going full comic book with it. And so like me being someone who grew up in comics, I want to see them go for it. You know what I mean? But I'm not necessarily the...
And you have to see that there's like a huge chance of failing when you do that.
Totally.
Because it can end up looking bad, and it has...
Well, it could be Batman. It could be Batman with
Right.
George Clooney. You know what I mean? It could be like that. It could be... They went for it. Mr. Freeze has a crazy suit in that movie, and he shoots ice, and they went full on for that. And like, you can swing and miss, and like, it cannot work. And I think really understanding the material, they can still go further as time goes on, as they go further into their movies here with the old guard. If they wanted to continue for a while, next one could be much more stylized, you know, in the history. You could differentiate sort of lighting styles and looks within the cinematic language, within the color schemes, within all that stuff in the different time periods.
I'm going to invoke a name that you're probably not going to expect me to invoke here.
Okay,
but,
go for it.
I was reminded of our coverage of Zack Snyder's Watchmen. And
In this?
Well, I'm just reminded of it in this conversation we're having. And one of the things that movie did well, although we both made the argument that it had many faults, and we talk about a lot of things that kept it from being amazing to us in that episode.
Well, just to say really quickly, mostly just like not fully fundamentally understanding the characters.
Yeah.
But yeah, continue.
Yes. But one of the things that was cool about that movie, I thought, was that how it actually captured a lot of the iconic scenes and look of characters in a way that didn't feel too cheesy. Like, it worked for me. I thought that movie looked good for the most part. For the most part. I'm not saying there weren't things I would quibble with, and we outlined it in the episode on it. But my point is, there's a way to like evoke the comic and like have some of the scenes play out in a way that evokes a panel that you've seen, without going full comic book and giving it a sheen of color that feels unreal.
Right. I mean, you still have like Night Owl in like an owl flying machine in that movie. So it's like they still went for comic booky. He just wanted dark and gritty.
What about the opening scene where the comedian gets smashed out the window and we see him fall,
right.
and like it looks just like the panel out of the comic, right? Like,
yeah, it's shot. He did shot for shot of the beginning.
Yeah.
But even
really
so,
cool.
like
I think you can overdo it, and I think he probably did, right. But some of it's cool.
I think you ask anybody who's a big Watchmen fan, that opening scene they like, because he did go shot for shot, and it wasn't he did the opening sequence of Watchmen. You know what I mean? And then he started to make changes and not understand things as well.
Anyway, my point being that I guess I feel like in the future they could maybe lean it a little bit more into some of the style from the comic, because I think the style of the comic is
Agreed.
so cool, and I really like it, and I just want to see some more homages to it. I like that her axe looks identical to how it does in the comic. Like, there are certain things they definitely did. And by the way, the cast I thought was perfect. I loved that they didn't mess with any of the characters, really. Like, they look a lot like they do in the comic. They act a lot like they do in the comic, and I thought they were perfectly cast, in my opinion, across the board.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I totally agree. I had a lot of fun, like sort of remembering how it was in the movie when reading the comic. It's really interesting to go about it in the way that I did. And I don't know that I prefer it. I don't know. I almost would say if people were interested and they haven't seen either and they, care after being spoiled because we spoiled everything. I would say definitely I would read first in hindsight.
I think that was the way to go. I mean, it's the way I went, so I don't know. I can't experience it the way you did, but I felt like it actually provided like this really great foundation for me. The one point of data I have against it, though, is that my wife watched the movie and loved it and had not read the comic. So it is, and many people I think have had that experience. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's to say, again, I don't think this is a bad movie. I just don't think it was amazing, and I think there were things about it that I just had to that when watching I was like, this could have improved it.
You know, and I think part of it probably falls to budget, and it's tough for me to like slam a movie for like they couldn't afford.
I mean, they had a $70 million budget.
Really?
$70 million budget. Yeah.
I you know, honestly, I don't know. Is that a lot? Like I don't really know.
I mean,
anymore.
it's like. It's not a little, I'll say that.
Okay. Well, they went to a lot of locations. I felt like they were actually in a lot of these different locations, you know, shooting, you know, so it's tough to say. Like, what was the money spent on? Hard to say. You know, and a lot of these, like, scenes they were doing throughout time, I'm sure that cost a lot of money to set up a battlefield and have horses and have, you know what I mean? Like, well, there's probably a lot of costuming. So I'm sure they had to pick and choose how they were going to spend their money.
Right. And I think in a sequel, if this movie gets a sequel, and because it was as big of a smash hit as it was, I think we'll see the product of a lot of the things that we want. You know, I think this movie achieved the
ramp up as far as
this movie achieved a lot of what it needed to for us to see the best version of the story, I think, going forward.
Yeah. And, you know, that I think segues into where we need to move next, which is we need to decide whether or not we liked the comic book or the film more. That's the thing we're doing this year. As you well know. So we're going to talk about that now. Do stick around for the very end of the episode where we're going to announce our next project. But I think, you want to go first? Are you cool with that?
Sure. I mean, mine's obvious, I think, at this point. I do want to say here at the end, though, there don't get me wrong, like, I enjoyed this movie. After the movie ended, credits were rolling, I thought that was enjoyable. I liked that movie. I think specifically coming into this conversation, I just wanted to have things that I felt like could have improved it and say why I didn't give it a 10 out of 10 and love it completely in every way.
Right.
So, and I think going to the comic book after watching the movie, only made my enjoyment, you know, in hindsight, even more of the movie. But I did notice the things that I wanted more of were in the comic, and the things that I was noticing, sort of more style, that kind of stuff was shown, I think, in my opinion, more in the comic book.
So you're going with the comic?
Yeah, comic book.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, so for me, I think I'm overall more positive on this project than you, if that's fair to say. I love this. I love the comic. I love the movie. I think both had flaws. Like we've outlined, I think there is some problems in the third act of this comic. I thought some of it maybe was a little too expected, and I wanted a little more. The movie I thought I really loved a lot of the extra things they gave us, the extra storylines. There was a lot of cool character moments. I think Niall we didn't talk a lot about, but there was a lot more Niall here, and her character was a little subtly different in the movie, it felt like to me. They made her, she also, like, the way she leaves and has to come back, like, that doesn't happen in the comic. There's certain things like that, she's maybe more on the fence about this whole thing, whereas I think Niall in the comic book sort of buys into it a little faster. In general, I liked a lot of that. I thought it was cool, and there was a real effort to provide an emotional context to the good that is done by these immortals over time. That big wall that Copley has assembled, where he shows all the good that Andy has done over time and that they have all done over time, and the power and like how they've averted catastrophe and like atomic war and like all this crazy stuff that he's attributing to them. That's all not in the comic. It's maybe subtextual, but it's not shown in that way. So I want to give the movie its due. I think it's a really, really good movie. I'll agree. It is maybe not quite big budget theater movie, yet it, for a Netflix movie, it's about as good as you're going to get, I think. I mean, I really had a great time with it. So I definitely recommend it. But all that being said, I'm going to give it to the comic, for reasons I think I've outlined, but I just want to hit on again. I think it's more stylish. I missed the sort of like sexiness of the comic. I felt like that was something that the movie could have done a little more of, and still been tasteful. Like I would want it to be the same sort of tasteful touch that the comic had. I think that's something you can do. You look at, speaking of Watchmen, HBO's Watchmen. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't shy away from some of this kind of stuff. So, like, I think you can go there and still be tasteful, and I think it does there. And I wanted maybe a little more of that for this adaptation, but I think it nails a lot of the stuff. But overall, I think if you want that, like, I think if you're looking for the best version of this story, in my opinion, it's the comic. But it's going to come down to, I think, honestly, for you, the listener, do you like comics or do you like movies more? Because if you're the kind of person who like, I don't know about comics, but I love movies, then I don't think I'm going to, you know what I mean? I don't think you're going to go read the comic and go, like, oh, this is way better. Like, you're probably going to like the movie better because that's your medium of choice. Now, if you're someone who does enjoy comics, or is open to them like I am, I think read the comic and then go see the movie. That's my advice.
It's always funny to me when, like, I don't want to be negative on projects. You know, that's like my first instinct is not to be negative. And then it just comes down so much. I think about subjectivity a lot. I just have to say the things that came up to me in my viewing.
Yeah. I think it's good when we have, I think when we come at something and there's a disagreement there, I think it provides interesting conversation, right? And this is the kind of thing as a listener, if you're a fan of this movie or if you're not a fan of this movie, hopefully you find some of your viewpoints represented here, and then also like this is the kind of thing you might encounter when you're talking about this movie with other people. So hopefully this was enjoyable for you, and maybe can give you some stuff to think about when next time the old guard comes up in conversation.
Right. I'm looking forward to the sequel. That's what I'll say. And then
me too.
Again,
and I hope they're going to make it, because as soon as they are, I'm going to be excited and go out and pick Volume 2. I may just pick it up anyway. I'm probably gonna pick it up anyway. Yeah, because I'm excited.
Well, yeah, that's something I wanted to say is like I do want to continue reading and everything. So the story's captivated me enough.
If they make a sequel, I think we're gonna cover it. In my opinion, I'm gonna push for it because it's easy to cover. It's like, you know what I mean. It's a movie and a comic. We can do it combo in an episode, and it'd be fun to touch back in with these characters.
Yeah, the story's dug its claws into me deep enough to where I'm like, I want to know what happens next. I want to know where these characters carry on.
Well, and I'm going to be really curious because I assume Andy is not mortal in Volume 2, or maybe becomes at some point in Volume 2. Right. But in the movie, she's going to start out that way, and I don't think they're going to change. I don't think they're going to reverse and make her immortal again for a while and then go. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't really understand how it fully works, because I feel like there are moments where he's like, I won't see you again, and she's like, you never know, and I'm like, yeah, I know you're being optimistic, but is that also code for like you're gonna become immortal again at some point, or like, you know what I mean? Like,
real quick, do we have a moment for a prediction? Because I think that, I mean, we saw at the end there's like a little post credits, not really post credit, but after a little bit in the credits, you see Quinn has showed up, right, and sees Booker, and the he's in like an apartment or something. He looks sad. He's like drunk or something.
Well, yeah, because they're separated for 100 years now.
And I think it's not a big stretch to say that I think these two are going to team up and be the sort of the opposing force for the other four. Right? It's going to be the two Immortals versus the four, and because they're going to represent maybe just like wanting to die or something. Like I love that these stories of immortality at their heart are about what it is to be mortal, right? Like that's what it boils down to. It's like what it is to be mortal. Is it okay to be mortal? Can we accept mortality? What are sort of the downsides of immortality, which sort of shines a light on mortality in a way. So I think I'm endlessly fascinated by this kind of character. Oh, another thing I want to shout out is another like similarity, Highlander a little bit. You ever watch a Highlander growing up?
Yeah, I can see that.
Like he's like, I mean, they're not cutting each other's heads off and gaining more power or anything, but like I remember one of the coolest characters from like a Highlander. I think his name was like Duncan or something, or maybe not Duncan, but there was a character who was like over like 2,000 years old. And I thought he was like one of the coolest characters because he was like so unknowable. Anyway, we've rambled into the woods. I think it's time to end this. Do stick around for the very end, though, where we're going to announce our next project. But if you like this episode, please let us know in the form of a rating and review on whatever podcast app you use. Great way to get the word out for fellow listeners.
If you want to support the podcast, please go to patreon.com/inktofilm and think about potentially joining one of our tiers. We have everything from $1 up. The $2 tier gets you our bonus episodes monthly, and we sort of try to cover something adaptation adjacent or adaptation news. It just kind of depends, but we've had a lot of fun with those, and we have over 25 of them now.
Yeah, definitely a good backlog there, which for $2 hopefully is pretty good value. Also, make sure to follow us on social media. We're at inktofilm on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And join the Council of Inklings on Facebook. It is our Facebook group where we have discussions and we share news and all sorts of fun stuff like that.
Thank you to Ross Bugdoon for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, man. So we're going to announce our next project, which is actually a patron commission, and that's going to be Screamers, 80s flicks. We're going back to the 80s, I believe 80s, maybe early 90s. I'm not actually sure.
Somewhere in there, yeah.
Somewhere in there. And it is based off of a Philip K. Dick short story, which I'm drawing a blank on the name of it now, but I do know it. I just have to remember it. But anyway, we're going to be covering that. It's going to be a Philip K. Dick, which is going to be like our third or fourth project we've done from him. And then another adaptation of his, which like I've seen it, but it was so long ago. I honestly remember next to nothing about this movie. Have you ever seen it?
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen this one.
Cool. So at the very least, it's going to be a new movie for you, and it'll be mostly new for me because my memory is bad and I've forgotten it at this point. So I don't know how good it is. Honestly, I have no idea. Maybe it'll be something we just tear into, but I suspect there'll be something interesting and good there to highlight. I don't think our patron would have commissioned it otherwise, but who knows? Anyway, that's what we're going to have next week. Until next time.
Thanks for listening.